Hello and welcome. This is going to be a presentation on Pax Fauna's narrative research. My name's Aidan, and I have been working on this for the last couple of years. So we wanted to give you a different way to kind of consume this. Probably found this video on the website, but narrative.paxfauna.org is another place that you can kind of look through all these findings. I'm just going to talk through some of the most important findings. Basically, this was a study looking at kind of on a deeper layer of how people in the public are kind of hearing and processing the messages of animal advocates and how we might design our messages differently to reach them in a different way. So, oops. A little bit background before we jump into the research itself. Pax Fauna is an organization that exists to kind of, in a number of different ways, try to reinvigorate the grassroots animal rights movement. New messaging is a big part of that, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're also exploring kind of new ways of directing the energy of grassroots activists into political campaigns that might open up new kind of opportunities for us. And we've looked, we're thinking a lot and doing a lot of research on how grassroots groups are kind of put together on the inside, so the internal dynamics. So those are some other of our work streams, but today we're just going to be talking about messaging. This study was inspired, and we kind of got the idea to do it based on some survey findings from the last decade that pointed to some interesting contradictions. So on the one hand, there were these surveys coming out showing that kind of surprisingly high numbers of people saying that they agreed with things like all animals should have the same rights as humans, 32% in a survey from Gallup in 2015, or really surprisingly high numbers of people supporting a ban on slaughterhouses or even a total ban on animal farming. So, on the one hand, those are like, whoa, what's going on? That sure doesn't line up with how people, are their own habits in terms of relating to those industries. And yeah, indeed, in the same surveys, 90% of people also agree with the statement that eating animals is a personal choice. And there's been no apparent real increase in vegetarianism over the last couple decades. It's still, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%. It's kind of hard to pin down. So what's going on here? When I first saw those surveys, I was, both excited, but also confused and frustrated. Like, how are people not seeing how, there's this huge contradiction in their thinking? But as we dug into it a little bit deeper, we found that there's kind of a whole field of research looking at just these kinds of contradictions, especially in, political issues or sort of issues of public interest. And it has to do with framing. So the idea of framing, maybe the most familiar example that we're all used to is, the glass half empty or glass half full. Different, whether just the words, basically framing is the idea that the words that we use and patterns in how we communicate always puts the emphasis on some information and maybe even more importantly, excludes or de-emphasizes other information, or kind of makes it harder for us to see. So patterns in language that draw our attention to some information while making it harder for us to pay attention to other information. This isn't always as obvious as the glass half full, half empty sort of thing. Another example, would be 20% fat versus 80% fat free. It kind of lands differently. 80% fat free maybe sounds like low fat, but oh wow, 20% fat, that might be high. And an even more subtle example, again, just like marketing here, is 20% off versus $120 off. It might not be, clear at first glance how people are going to receive these two things, but 20% off might emphasize kind of a high discount, whereas $120 off might actually kind of put the emphasis on $120 might put the emphasis on the large sticker, the large price to begin with. So we don't know. We wouldn't know how people would receive these things unless we asked them. And that was really the idea of this study. We had this contradiction this discrepancy in how people were talking about their views on animal farming And we wanted to figure out what was going on. And in particular, from the beginning, it was fairly clear. It was easy enough to explain the responses on the bottom here. So this 97% agreeing eating animals is a personal choice. The values in that statement are I mean, personal choice. We call this way of talking about the issue the consumer frame, or, and we borrow that term from some other research that we were able to find. And the consumer frame is, it's the kind of the default way that people are used to talking and thinking about food. When they think of food, they picture themselves at restaurants or shopping at the grocery store. Their personal kind of consumer relationship to the companies that sell food to them. So that became pretty clear early on as we were starting to do this research. But on the other hand, what were the kind of frames or values or beliefs or metaphors are often the way that frames manifest? What was going on under the hood when people say these strong pro-animal views, like 32% of people saying animals should have the same rights as humans? And if we could design a message that could activate that way of thinking, then maybe all of a sudden we would go from having 1 to 5% of people seem like supporters of the animal rights movement to suddenly 32%. So could we kind of unlock this evidence that there's kind of public support that's latent? So this inactive support among the public for the animal rights movement. Could we find messages that would unlock that? That was our goal. And we realized right away that a new story, a new kind of framing or message for our movement to tell has a lot of obstacles to overcome. So on the one hand, to start with, it has to overcome the consumer frame we were just talking about. And that's going to be a big challenge, because not only is that the default way that Americans are used to thinking about food, it's also how a lot of animal advocates have historically messaged about the issue. So messaging that focuses on consumer change, on going vegan, vegetarian, reinforces the consumer frame. It's talking about the issue as a consumer issue, where it is the individual's choice to change what they buy, and we're just asking people to make a different choice. We have to shift away, or if we want to unlock that other support and deactivate that really strong opposition, we would have to get out of the consumer frame. And doing so, we had this goal of inspiring collective action. So shifting from a frame that focuses on just individual consumer behavior to collective action, and that specifically is political action. So creating a role for the government in this issue, which people currently just see as one that's all about my personal choice of what I buy at the store. That high support, whatever it is, for a ban on slaughterhouses suggests there's something else when if we talk about it as an issue that there's a role for laws. And then we had some kind of additional goals of seeing if we could find a way of talking about the issue that would not get us bogged down. If we are going to move into the sort of political space and have this be a political issue, could we not get bogged down in existing partisan divides and get kind of yoked to only one political identity, which is naturally a kind of danger if we're going to get involved if we're going to frame our issue as a political one, and also to expand the constituency. So sort of, again, going back to some of those early data, if vegetarians are only 1 to 5% of people, but if we could find a way of talking about it where suddenly those 32% who say all animals should have the same rights as humans, if all of them support our movement and even could get active for it, suddenly we'd be a really important force. So those were kind of the goals as we were going into this research. The process, this is just the last little bit before we actually jump into specific findings that you can apply as an advocate. Just say a little bit about kind of how we went about this. So basically in 5 steps, we started with a review of existing research, both on framing as a field and studying just the psychology behind framing and how people think about messages and language and political issues, and also research specifically about public opinion of animal farming, of which there's a great deal. So we digested all of that. That helped kind of form our questions for following stages. We also analyzed all the messages that are currently being used by both not only animal advocates, but also the industry, the animal farming industry and the media, who are kind of this, third party, not neutral at all. They have their own agenda. So what are all the messages that are currently being used, or especially the stories and narratives that are currently being told about this issue? And we brought all that into private one-on-one interviews with ordinary Americans, mediating Americans who we recruited off of Reddit for 30-minute interviews. And we just dug deep in these interviews into people's views about farming animals. And it was, we were able to go get into their views in a way that isn't really possible in a short form survey. So we did about more than 70 of those interviews before we shifted to group interviews, where we were actually testing messages based on what we found in the individual interviews. And then wrapped that all up with some surveys that are currently ongoing. So we'll be able to share findings from those soon. So today I'm going to mostly focus on the findings from the qualitative stage, especially the interviews and the focus groups. So in a nutshell, the story of kind of where we are right now in our relationship with the public is that we really focus our messaging energy on convincing people about the harms of animal farming. So animal advocates kind of debate about the merits of messages focused on animal cruelty versus environmental damage versus, health, whether animal-based diets are healthy. And all that is about convincing people that farming animals is harmful in one way or another. But we really found that people already know that, by and large, especially when it comes to animal cruelty. People are well aware of it. Most people have seen slaughter footage, or are at least aware that cruelty is widespread, and it bothers them. And it bothers them maybe more than they're willing to admit on surveys. So we found it was much more consistent that people actually expressed really kind of deep misgivings about the use of animals in the food system than surveys have typically found. But you had to dig a little bit. So I'll say more about that in a second. So we're spending all this time trying to convince people that farming animals is harmful. But really, like I said, they're already there, and there's something else going on that's stopping them from bringing their either their personal consumer, whether you're just thinking about their personal consumer behavior or their kind of political views, in line with that. So we kind of talk about a few layers here, starting with just avoidance. It's very common for people to just so they know what goes on inside of farms, maybe doesn't line up with their values, but they just try to avoid thinking about it. It was amazing how many people in our interviews said almost exactly, I try not to think about that when I'm buying meat. It was very, very common. So this first layer is kind of this avoidance, and that's where maybe surveys have not been able to get past that sort of avoidant layer where people just don't want to look at it. Underneath that, if you can get through that kind of avoidant layer, we find this very strong ambivalence or dissonance, or like they're torn about, on the one hand, they're deeply uncomfortable with knowing that farming animals is so harmful, and on the other hand, feeling very attached to meat from animals. And so we can look at, as they would be kind of stewing in this ambivalence and this dissonance and kind of wrestling with their with this kind of seemingly familiar conundrum, we would start to hear some very consistent patterns of the ways that the rationalizations that they would bring in to kind of defend their choice to continue eating animals. So there were a lot of justifications that we heard, and for most people who have ever done outreach to the public about animal rights or veganism, these are going to be really familiar things. Culture and tradition, so talking about the important role that meat and animal foods play in their cultural traditions or in their family, they were raised that way. Naturalness, the sense that it's natural for humans to eat animals. It connects us to our sort of more ancient ancestors. It's how we evolved. The idea of the food chain or the circle of life or the cycle of nutrients were things that we heard about a lot. Just straight up people being willing to be honest that, that it just tastes so good that they're not willing to that it's hard for them to think about changing. And health, the health point is probably the most controversial. A lot of people do think that meat is a necessary part of a healthy diet, or at least helpful to have animal products in a healthy diet. But even more than all of those, the most common rationalization that we heard, the most consistent thing, and what would happen with some of those other justifications is that people would bring it up, but then they could kind of talk themselves through it. They might realize that it was flawed or that they didn't quite align with their values or their views. But there was one justification, rationalization that was just so consistent and so effective for enabling people to kind of disengage from the question entirely and just say it doesn't matter, which is futility. So this was the idea basically that it doesn't matter what I do because everyone else is still going to eat meat. So I could change my diet, I could go vegan even, but it doesn't matter because there's billions of other people who are going to keep eating meat and they're never going to change, and the industry is never going to change, and all the restaurants that are serving meat every day are never going to change. So it doesn't matter what I do. And so I might as well just keep eating meat because it makes me feel good for all those reasons we mentioned before. Yeah, here's a couple representative quotes. I feel like corporations are so huge, they have so much power. What is a normal person supposed to do? Or, I could be less of a hypocrite. I could go vegan. This like hypocrite language, really surprising how among these meat eaters that we were interviewing, how often they kind of used self-critical language to describe their relationship with eating animals. So I could go vegan, but realistically, it doesn't matter. It's not going to offset anything. Lots of people would have to do it all together. And this really emphasizes, let's see what my next slide is, that, it's such a, people, if you look into these quotes, people are really, you can see the tie between futility and the consumer frame that we talked about before. So when people are thinking about the issue as themselves as a consumer, all through the consumer frame basically is framing out anything but the consumer and the thing that they're buying from, the company that they're buying from. And without anything else to see, and with everything else being kind of excluded from the frame, like in this first quote, they're just seeing themselves as a layman. The only two characters are the lay consumer and the corporation. And it's like the balance of power between those two is so lopsided. The corporations have so much power, I have no power. What do I do? Or in the second one, it's just kind of taking it for granted that it's just about what they're going to do as an individual. So this kind of stresses how much overcoming futility is kind of exactly goes hand in hand with getting out of the consumer frame and trying to find a different way of framing the issue, that rather than only showing kind of the corporation and the individual, we have to get something into the frame where people can act together, where it's actually possible to imagine, how people could act together. And what that is government, that the government is how we as a society act collectively, and that the government could step in and do things to set society on a course towards collectively moving away from farming animals. And I'm just going to kind of put a pin right now that this isn't a totally new thing. There's a lot of animal advocates who have been trying to message about systemic change as opposed to consumer change, or have been talking about that, for at least a decade, I'm sure much longer. The difficulty is that the way that we currently talk about systemic change just doesn't really translate to the public, to our audience. Like even just the words systemic change don't really mean a lot. That was what we found with the people we were interviewing. Those words don't really mean a lot to most people who, don't think about politics or food systems or whatever. It's just kind of empty. It just doesn't really paint a clear picture for them of what we actually mean. So the challenge in our interviews, and it took us many rounds of interviews to kind of iterate on what people were saying and try to draw out, language that would make sense to the next people that we would interview, to describe, this kind of collective way of approaching the issue. And finally, based on things that the participants themselves said in their own language, we found something that kind of more reflects how these lay people think about the issue, language that puts it in their own terms. And that was evolution. So this metaphor of evolution, that society is evolving away from, and specifically, evolving together. We're all together as a society evolving away from farming animals. So this is an example of text that we used, many different versions of this in our research to get this kind of idea of this social evolution across the text here. We're calling for an evolution away from meat at the societal level, where consumers, food producers, restaurants, and grocery stores, so specifically kind of really painting a specific picture of how is this going to look, who are all the people involved, like I said before, not just casting, you know, consumers and corporations, but starting to name like the government. Yeah, all right, you get it. So this evolution metaphor was really kind of a watershed moment in our study in terms of people really getting on board with the idea. Once, I mean, really, like I said, it was the participants who started to introduce that metaphor. And then when we started to reflect it back to people, that really led to a shift in people understanding, rather that, you know, that we were asking them to go vegan and that they felt, you know, sort of hopeless and futile, that it's just acting as a consumer, that we were talking about this kind of potentially political movement, and people even started to compare it to a social movement. So some of these examples on the bottom left, I would think that was a good thing. I would think it would be good to get dragged along, you know, all right, there's an 80% tax on beef, and we hadn't suggested any sort of specific policies yet at this point. So they're starting to think in terms of policies, and even, you know, think in terms of, oh, this isn't about me, it's about society. And I would even, you know, get dragged along, but I would think it was a good thing. So that's a really good example of kind of just what a great shift we were able to see in our participants when we found a way to talk about it as a collective change that made sense to them. I'm going to just skim over this slide. You can read a lot more about this at the website about all this research, which is narrative.paxfauna.org. I mentioned a bunch of other justifications earlier. So once we were able to overcome futility, there were still these other justifications or rationalizations that then came back as an obstacle. And you know, there's not any magic bullets, and probably a lot of people who are used to doing, you know, vegan outreach have found effective ways to get over these. But we do have some recommendations on how to handle each of these kind of most common justifications. Kind of the only other thing I'll say about it right now is just that we should be proactively addressing things. So when all of our message design is about how harmful farming animals is, but the reality is people, you know, are kind of past that. They have these other rationalizations that they're holding on to. And when we never kind of talk about those things, it leads people to see us as a bit out of touch. It makes us seem a little bit out of touch because we're not speaking to the real kind of issues that are holding people back. So if we could just kind of, you know, another thing we can do as advocates is to start proactively addressing some of these things and taking it for granted that these are really common. And I think some of us, you know, often it's easy to kind of roll our eyes at some of these rationalizations, but just try to find, you know, some empathy, some validity of these things so that we can just kind of proactively address them and take them seriously. That's a great place to start. So we're going to talk a little bit about the second phase where we got into testing specific messages. And for, you know, a lot of these messages were designed to do all kinds of things, try to overcome the rationalizations I just talked about, try to, you know, take the evolution message a little bit further. So this is when we shifted into focus groups, group interviews. And the idea here was that while the private interviews, we could, you know, really get deep into one person's kind of deep views and they would feel safe to do that. The group interview, these were two to five, sometimes even six participants along with a facilitator. And this more closely approximates how people are actually going to hear these messages in the real world and make sense of them and talk to them with their friends, talk about them to their friends. And decide, you know, where they're going to stand on animal freedom as it becomes more and more of a political issue. So seeing kind of in this setting, we could see people who would push back against the messages and which kind of counter arguments were most effective that we needed to find a better way to address. And then, yeah, just lastly there, we found that the strongest kind of predictor of, demographically speaking, the strongest predictor of support or opposition towards the messages was political inclination. So we decided to focus only on kind of center and liberal respondents, just so that we could kind of be able to really see what was working. We found that with conservative respondents, at least for our research, we weren't able to find anything that worked. So it wasn't productive for us. This is an example of the kind of message that we were testing. So we would show the participants these images that were sort of designed to look like they might be a social media ad, something that you might see scrolling through Facebook and has a message on it. And our interest was primarily in the messages. This is made to look like potentially an ad for a ballot measure. In fact, we told the participants that these ads were about a real ballot measure. And they were told that was a fictional ballot measure. And at the end of the study, they were told that that was just fictional, but to try to create some sense that the stakes were real and this was a law that could really happen. So that's kind of what the layout is. And like the yes on 300 is all, referring to this fictional ballot measure. I'm going to mostly focus on kind of 3 components of messaging for the rest of this presentation, just so that there's a lot of different things that make up a message, and some of the ones that we focus more on or had more useful recommendations about. One is like tone, so the kind of emotional register that we use when we present a message. One is the messenger, who's saying it, how does that influence how people receive it and whether they're willing to listen to it, and then of course just the content of the message itself, what is being said. So for tone, we're going to talk about the use of kind of facts and statistics, like hard kind of number stuff, along with emotions, and how we can kind of strike a balance between those like data-based appeals and emotional appeals, which was just that balance was kind of an interesting, tricky challenge. So starting with just the facts and how people responded to those, it saw some really interesting contradictions in how people engaged with like factual claims in the messages that we were testing. So for instance, if a message, made a claim about X% of greenhouse gas emissions coming from farming animals. On the one hand, participants really said that they wanted to hear, I'll just remind myself what my next slide is. Participants said that they wanted more facts in the messages, and messages are, they wanted to argument based on numbers. They kind of identified as, you're going to win me over by the numbers. I want to, just identify what's true and make a good sort of well-informed decision. But when we included numbers or numerical claims in the message, a really common response was to question how credible that number was and say, oh, well, who was behind that study, or where does that, what study is it from? Or, I hear basically there's a quote, something like, well, every week there's a different study about coffee. Like last week it was going to kill you, and this week you need 3 cups a day to, live until you're 80. So which is it? And they're just kind of steeped in so much information and the impression that there's so much misinformation that they don't know what to trust, really creates a puzzle for our participants, and that really manifested in how they responded to our messages. So with that said, we do have some recommendations about how to approach facts. To start with, we definitely recommend including numbers, that generally speaking, when possible, every claim will be stronger. It just seems more authoritative when there's a numerical data point. So even if you're talking about, the like animals' personalities or their capacities, like just using some kind of numerical claim and seeing that number there, that's really the signal that like this is an authoritative, science-backed claim. So that's using numerical claims in every message as much as possible. Specifically, the strongest factual claims were those that made the comparison to the status quo. So not just saying, an example would be not just saying, meat causes X% of greenhouse gas emissions, but saying by switching away from meat, we could cut Y% of greenhouse gas emissions. So specifically making the comparison. So that, and again, that's because people are kind of, actually quite savvy about detecting what might be misinformation or when a number might be kind of being used in a dishonest or manipulative way. So making that specific comparison, you're showing, here's all the information you need to kind of make a decision. providing a citation. And, in a social media ad, this didn't mean we, said like with a little star that, oh, this is from this Harvard study from 2017 or whatever. It was just something as simple as a link on the slide or in whatever format your messaging is happening, telling people where they can get more information and having that well organized, a link on the slide where you've organized different links based on what you're claiming. Most people probably aren't going to look at that, but we found that it was very reassuring for our participants to see that there was a place that they could go. And in the setting in our focus groups, they couldn't even click through because it was, they were seeing the slide on a computer. But that just hugely helped and provided a lot more confidence in the claims that were being made. And lastly, resisting the temptation ever to exaggerate numbers. People are really on the lookout for dishonest use of data, and even slight exaggerations could, especially if people do go look it up or they later hear something else, that will really has the potential to really damage their trust in animal advocates. We can trust that the numbers, as they are, and even on the low ends of the spectrum, for instance, when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, even the relatively low numbers are compelling to people, and just the facts the facts are on our side. So we never need to exaggerate. We can even tend towards the more modest claims with the numbers, and it'll still be really persuasive. People aren't expert enough to differentiate, 17% versus 31% GHG. Like, they don't know which, that the 17% is good enough. That's compelling. That was what we found. Okay, so moving from facts to talking about emotions, which is really the other side of this balance. And again, we really found that how people were engaging with emotional appeals was kind of contradictory, or even posed this kind of paradox for us. So on the one hand, people are saying that they want these factual things, and it's necessary, like some kind of emotional connection is like, why do we care about this? Why do we care that, even if we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, why do we care about greenhouse gas emissions? But there's got to be some kind of emotional connection that's like, oh, well, what's going to happen if, runaway climate change is not brought under control? So that's some kind of emotional connection is necessary to make the message relevant at all. And without that, people don't even pay attention to it. On the other hand, emotional appeals were very often seen as manipulative. And I think in particular for animal advocates, the public is primed to see animal advocates as overly emotional and emotionally manipulative. They talked about, slaughter footage, showing slaughter footage being inherently, even just, we're just showing true footage, it's not doctored at all. They talked about that as being an emotionally manipulative strategy. So this is a really complex thing for animal advocates to navigate. We do have some suggestions about how to go about making emotional appeals in your message. The first step is to just tone it down. Look at the way that animal advocates typically talk and remove as much as possible, we should remove like adverbs, take our descriptions of the practices inside of modern farming. And again, this is a sort of situation where just the facts are troubling enough. We don't need to like turn it up with these really kind of strong emotional language. People see that as kind of excessive, as unserious, and as manipulative. So leave room for the questioner themselves to kind of make those emotional conclusions. And one really effective way to do this was questions. So this is an example of a message that originally, so just read the message: whatever the industry might claim, I don't think anybody with a heart in their chest can watch the videos from slaughterhouses and not feel disgusted. Animals deserve freedom from slaughter. We focus on our freedom, but what about theirs? Originally, well, let's just say, first of all, this is a strongly emotional message. And this is just the kind of message that people might be disposed to see as kind of manipulative, or really appealing to, or even judgmental. They might get defensive to it. And originally that was what was happening, but originally the second half of the message, instead of what's there now, it said something like, we have no right to keep doing this when we could switch to an animal-free food system. When we replace that kind of conclusion with this question, even though it's obviously a rhetorical question, like it's leading to say we don't think about their freedom, that's the answer. But just that simple change, and there was other examples of this too, where a question kind of leaves space for the listener to kind of connect the dots, like leave some role for them to sort of actively engage with the message. And that was really effective. It really reduced defensiveness. It made people much less likely to report that they saw it kind of as manipulative. So toning down the language, which doesn't mean getting, and so as we'll see in a second, that doesn't mean getting rid of emotional appeals. So another recommendation is let pictures kind of do the emotional lifting for us. So this little cute picture of this baby cow sticking his tongue out, I mean, that to me, I immediately have an emotional connection to that, and that was what we found was true for most of our participants, even regardless of gender, like people fawned and they were affected by this cute cow, and that can kind of has a direct effect that text, like they can't attribute any kind of manipulative nature to the speaker. Now that said, that's not always true. I just said a minute ago that slaughter images were likely to be seen as manipulative. So we kind of found a way to strike that balance, and there's some kind of gross image on this next slide, so it's just a warning. But the cute pictures of animals thriving creates, so on the one hand, it's just trusting that happy animals, thriving animals, that creates an emotional connection with our issue. And on the other hand, kind of going, so then if that's, here in the process, and then slaughter, the moment of slaughter is so graphic and extreme and, upsetting that it kind of shuts people down. Then over on the past that, is images of animals' bodies after slaughter, but while they're still kind of recognizable, while their bodies are still recognizable. I'm just going to change off that slide because it's not pleasant. Those created a strong disgust reaction, but without being kind of so strong and leading to people to shut down the way that slaughter images did, images of slaughter. And then the last strategy here is just kind of explicitly making the case for emotional arguments. And why do we have James Cromwell on that image? Because we used him as a messenger for this kind of message. Don't need to worry. We'll talk more about messengers in a second, but here's the message. If you have an emotional reaction to seeing footage of animals suffering inside slaughterhouses, that's a good sign that you're a human being. So basically what he's saying is, we should listen to our emotions. Yes, it is an emotional issue, and that's okay. And, basically by being explicit that we are arguing for emotions as information and as valid information to kind of take into account with this question, that's not that we were able to not have that not be seen as manipulative. People didn't see it as manipulative because it's explicit in its intentions, and so that was really another effective way. Again, people who might have reacted that way to another message saw this one and kind of said, yeah, okay, I mean that's a good point. It should matter. It kind of reminds them that that's something that they can think through the right frame. Okay, so that's everything on emotion. We're going to talk a little bit about messengers, and we're getting pretty close to the end here. So when we're talking about messaging for political causes, often a lot of emphasis is placed on kind of the authority of the messenger. So, often political movements will, choose to use people who are seen as high-ranking members of society or whatever it is. We found that at least when it comes to our issue, animals, and sort of animal cruelty, the most important qualities were relatability rather than authority. Relatability and kind of trustworthiness being connected to that. So we'll look more at both of these. Sort of mentioned alluded before earlier on to defensiveness, as that people are really primed coming into the interviews. It was amazing how much people were primed to react defensively to kind of any mention that, oh, we're going to be talking about animals used for food. And they're so, whether that's because they've seen judgmental messages or had judgmental conversations in the past with animal advocates, or just because they feel guilt and shame and it's kind of their way of diverting that. The key, it's a really big challenge for advocates to overcome this reflexive defensiveness, and using relatable messengers was kind of the, let's say, who was delivering the message we found was a really effective way to engage with defensiveness. And specifically having messengers who specifically mention that they still eat meat was a really effective way to do that, because if the person talking and speaking in support of some kind of animal rights political opportunity is still a meat eater, then they can't possibly be judging you for still being a meat eater too. And it sort of, the meat eating messenger sort of provides a pathway for people who have not yet changed their diet to become active supporters of the animal movement, even if that just means changing the way that they vote in favor of animal related issues. So we have this fictional firefighter named Barney Lewis, and he's just kind of the picture of a regular, dude firefighter guy. And he's saying, I was always horrified by the images coming out of slaughterhouses, but I love a good burger. I couldn't imagine a world without meat. And then I had a shift, these new animal foods from Burger King have changed my perspective, and now I can really imagine things changing. Pretty much everything in this quote is exact quotes, or it's cobbled together language that we heard from participants in our study. So he's basically speaking to the exact kind of ambivalence that so many Americans feel in relation to animal food. And that was, again, just a really effective way to kind of melt through that defensiveness. People really identified with Barney's statement, and then they could sort of see, I too can support this as a political cause. Just another example of this is, something we use lots of examples of. Okay, I already said what I was going to say on this slide, but really exciting one. We called this grandma. We called this fictional grandma Lupe Morales, and the one reason that meat-eating messengers were effective, and especially maybe the most effective meat-eating messengers, were the ones who disrupted people's expectations about what type of people are going to be advocating for animals. So using people who aren't typically, people from demographics that aren't typically associated with veganism. So older people, people of color, men, and working class people, people from any of those demographics or several of those demographics. It's kind of not who people are expecting to see advocating for veganism or for animal rights. And so using those people and making it credible that they're still meat eaters, or telling these really relatable stories that are the way that most people relate to the issue, and then describing their personal transformation or their personal moment of awakening to how they came to support animal freedom as a political cause. Very effective. And before we move on to content, this one is a bit more of kind of a challenge for us. It's not something that we necessarily figured out an effective way to do it, but we heard versions of this quote from several participants. This one is an exact quote. If the animal could walk up to me and say, hey, don't eat me, then I wouldn't eat you. People basically saying, oh, well, the problem is, like, the animals can't really tell me themselves whether they want to live or they feel pain. And I think, most animal advocates, we know that that's not true. If we actually listen and are attentive to how animals act, we can see that they are telling us certainly things as simple as, we don't want to die. So this was a message that we did test, and it did do very well, where we're kind of starting to try to attribute that message that I don't want to be eaten to animals. But this is kind of a challenge for us as advocates, and an invitation to anyone watching this video that, how could we, what could it look like to cast the animals themselves as the messengers of some of these messages that we're talking about. Okay, moving on. We had some findings about policy demands. So what sorts of messages, or sorry, what sorts of asks, how people responded to different asks. And the radical flank effect is kind of the key takeaway there. Say what that means. First, at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that all of this research was kind of inspired by these survey findings over the last decade that found really high, support for things like banning all slaughterhouses, or the statement that all animals deserve the same rights as humans. And from our own research, and also research that's kind of since come out more recently while we were just finishing up our own research, just want to encourage everyone to actually take that with a pretty significant spoonful of salt. There's good reason to kind of doubt that kind of simple, straightforward, latent public support exists, in like that. I think it's pretty clear from ours and from other research that it's not the case that a third to a half of Americans are sitting around thinking that they would support a ban on slaughterhouses, or if they had the chance to vote on that today, they would do it. It does point to exactly the kind of contradictions that I've been talking about, that they are deeply conflicted about the issue. But it's activating that support is more complicated. It's not as simple as giving them just a chance to vote on a ban on slaughterhouses or a ban on meat. Specifically, we started, especially when we shifted to focus groups and we were testing specific messages, we told, like I mentioned earlier, we told people about a fictional ballot measure, and we were kind of gauging, based on these messages, would you support it or not? And in the early stage, what we said that fictional ballot measure did was ban meat. And people said, whoa, that's way too extreme. You need to slow it down. So they would say, maybe if the measure said we're going to ban meat, 3 years from now, meat will be banned. They would say, that's way too fast. Slow it down. Like 30 years maybe isn't a reasonable amount of time to do that. So then we would, with the next group, the next round of groups, we would say, okay, now the ballot measure says ban meat in 30 years. And they would say, whoa, that's way too much. That's way too radical, too extreme. You can't do that. Just, tax meat, like make it more expensive, but you can't just ban it outright. So, okay, a couple focus groups later, now we try tax meat. And they say, whoa, and so you get where I'm going with this. Basically, whatever people were shown, they didn't support it. Almost whatever they were shown. They said they didn't support that. They would support something less extreme than that. But what they were first shown really had a huge sort of influence on what they said they would support. And so as we got less and less kind of radical with what we were suggesting, what they would accept also got less radical. To the point that, when we suggested subsidizing animal-free meat, they said, oh, how about just, a public education program, which just means basically do nothing. And this is a fantastic opportunity for advocates to kind of set the stage. Like basically what we come out with as a movement collectively, the span of demands that we make really can have this would suggest that it can have a huge sculpting effect on what people see as, a reasonable proposal. And it's not, it's not enough to have, I think the effect of this was really that they were reading about a ballot measure really being pushed for in a state. Typically we use Colorado or Oregon. That might actually, that made it very real that this might actually pass. So it's not enough to stand on a sidewalk and have a sign that says, we should ban meat or wear a ban meat t-shirt. But if we're actually pursuing, is to say those things won't have this effect of making people accept a more radical proposal. But if we're actually pursuing, really radical proposals through a pathway that credibly might, cause them to be enacted, that is where we found this effect. So having some, having a radical flank within our movement that is pursuing, these really ambitious policies that are really what we want, will make other stepping stones more, more feasible, seem more feasible to people. A couple other things that we found about how people engage with specific policies. So people strongly, there's this, even as we're trying to get out of the consumer frame, which really values sort of personal choice and freedom, and people still are used to seeing it that way, and they really, the sort of idea of freedom and restricting freedom came up a lot. So people really prefer non-restrictive policies. So if we have an option between, say, banning something and something else that could have potentially as large of an impact by taxing something or subsidizing something else, whatever the kind of range of possible ideas is, things that advocates might think of, I mean, the government spending tons of money on alternative proteins is certainly more radical than banning some obscure food item. But we generally found Americans are willing to tolerate a lot more as long as it isn't seen as kind of infringing on a freedom. We also found that welfare policies, this isn't, I don't state this next one with a ton of confidence, but there was evidence from our interviews that policies that just change welfare measures don't support the evolution narrative, the idea that we're completely moving away from using animals for food. So that's not to say that welfare policies aren't worth pursuing, but it may not be kind of the foot that we want to put forward towards the public. It might not be the kind of demand that we really want to focus on with public messaging, because it may not convey that sense that we're evolving away from it completely. And then affordability is this last thing. A really common concern that I haven't mentioned at all yet in this video was cost, that animal-free diets are seen as kind of an expensive luxury that not everyone can afford. And that, on one hand was a challenge, or it was an obstacle for us, because it was come up as a reason or an excuse or whatever you want to say, that people wouldn't change or would be cautious about supporting that evolution away. But it also actually presents an opportunity for advocates if we design policies that are specifically targeting affordability. It presents an opportunity to kind of invert that and take it from being, something that people are wary of us, to us really, showing that we are down to earth and care about the things that they care about and understand, their economic realities, and we're concerned about them, and we want to sort of make that the solution. So it's policies that have to do with making, animal-free diets more affordable are a great opportunity to kind of flip something from an obstacle to, something that can play to our advantage. And those are just some specific policies that we were kind of surprised to find ourselves, really interested in as we came out of this research. Okay, I'm gonna blast on. You can read more about all that on the website. Before the summary, the last little section that I'm going to share is just a few examples of some specific narratives that we really recommend advocates could make more use of as we try to shift our issue to being about, a political movement seeking to change laws rather than just a consumer movement seeking to change people's sort of consumer practices. This one we've already seen, but it's it's the message of the the meat-eating messenger, which is this consumer voter conversion. So the story of one person kind of having an awakening experience, shifting their perspective from just being a consumer and seeing it as a consumer issue and being kind of trapped in that futility, to seeing it as a voter and something where they can engage, as a citizen, as a member of their community, on a policy where everyone's evolving together. So again, Barney is kind of describing that transition for himself, and that's a really kind of those are really effective stories to tell. Individual meat-eating person realizing that there is hope through collective action. And another one is really specifically targeting the humane deception. Again, lots of advocates already doing this very skillfully. One specific recommendation we have, I mean, we think there's more opportunity. This is a really good point for advocates to press. And an angle here is the first words of this message. It's no secret. We tested around a lot of kind of subtle versions of that, and that was what we landed on. Basically trying to imply that, you know, the humane marketing is a deception and everyone knows it. And no one wants to be the one who's kind of left out and, you know, the one person who's being duped by this deceptive marketing. And people, as we said before, they're skeptical of facts, they're skeptical, you know, they're on the lookout for deceptive marketing. So people were well primed to receive this message. It's completely factual. We all know, you know, this is a sort of effective way to attack the kind of idea of free range. And so that starting with that, like, it's no secret, or kind of, it's just telling people that it's, you know, widely known that these are not accurate or honest messages. Okay, basically just going to summarize everything that we've gone over for this video so far, and that'll be it. So, you know, the basic story that we're trying to tell about how the public is relating to our issue right now is that people use futility as a justification to dismiss our message. They say, it doesn't matter what I do, I'm just one person, and the world's never going to change, so why should I? And that futility is closely linked to the consumer frame, the default way people are used to thinking about food, just picturing themselves buying food at the grocery store, ordering at a restaurant, and in that sense, they feel totally powerless. And advocate messages often reinforce the consumer frame, either intentionally. A lot of, you know, vegan advocacy talking about changing your diet, of course, you know, is intentionally appealing to people to make a consumer choice. And we found even messages that are trying to get out of the consumer frame can inadvertently activate it. And you know, we write a lot more about this in reports, but a lot of advocates, including ourselves, who've in the past tried to message about systemic change, we find ourselves actually falling back into the consumer frame because there's so many ways to inadvertently activate it just because it's the dominant frame people are used to using. The key that for us to shift our relationship with the public and unlock all this latent public support and turn that kind of ambivalence that people have into to mobilize that into something that is going to support, you know, pro-animal laws, is the shift from the consumer frame to what we could call a citizen frame. And by citizen, I don't, you know, mean to focus on like non-citizens, but just citizen meaning a member of a society, member of a community, actively participating in society. Voting is a way that we do that, so we could also call it like a voter frame. We need to tell a story about, you know, in our case, we were focused on the United States, but in whatever country, you know, Americans, people of that, people as citizens, as members of the society and the nation coming together and acting in the interests of the whole by passing laws. We kind of recommend some certain things to try to include in every message when, you know, the format allows for it. So a relatable, credible messenger, someone who's, you know, normal, seems like them, not sort of like veganism is seen as this elite thing. So having people who who represent the demographics that aren't typically thought of as likely to be vegan and even eat meat. A restrained emotional connection. So you've got to find some way to make it emotionally relevant. Just telling the stories of what actually happens in farms, or using images of thriving animals, or explicitly appealing to emotion, but still always without using, you know, that really elevated emotional language, lots of adverbs and descriptive words. Including some non-exaggerated numerical fact about the message, you know, relevant to whatever the topic of the message is, and a citation or a link, directing people where they can go to read further about the claim that you made. Really recommend using this frame of society evolving together. Again, in some of the reports about this, we get more into what that evolution metaphor is doing. It does a lot of heavy lifting for us, so we can really, and the key is, you know, just knowing that that's a way, that's a metaphor that really helps people understand what we're talking about. So really useful, really recommend using that. And then sort of last point is here is just proactively, if you're designing, messages that are going to go out to the public, preempting some of these common rationalizations we've talked about. So that's culture, tradition, naturalness, freedom of choice. Again, we talk more about each of these specifically in some of our reports, so that's a great place to go look further for that. Using potentially mediators as messages, using animals as messengers. Yeah, that's it. If any of this was exciting, you can, a couple ways to get connected with our work. You can join our mailing list. That's going to be, as we release more research like this, really our focus is on grassroots animal advocates, how we can make grassroots campaigns more effective, but a lot of this might be relevant to any animal advocates, so it's a great place. We are getting ready to launch some exciting pilot campaigns in Colorado this year, so that's definitely telling about that. You can support our work at paxfauna.org by becoming a donor. And we are always looking for volunteers, as I just mentioned. We're starting to do some serious campaigns, so there's always opportunities there. All right. Well, thanks so much for watching.